So let's talk about the Republicans in this situation. Um, for the most part, Republicans are not talking about a specific form of economic stimulus. They are talking about stimulus regarding or stimulus for specific industries, be it the hotel industry, the airline industry. They are talking about stimulus generally in the form of the PPP. You may even hear a few people, I mean, a very few Republicans talk about stimulus for the unemployed, more of that kind of federal bolstered stimulus for those who are in the position where they have to receive unemployment payments. But for the most part, again, Republicans are not talking about stimulus. And when they do, they are not saying very much. I've said before, again, is my as is my favorite phrase now. In a previous episode, I've mentioned how just as a matter of like a life lesson, you don't want to just always listen to what people say. You want to actually look at what they are doing, right? And so that begs the question: what are the Republicans actually doing on this issue? Well, earlier this month, we saw specifically in the Senate, we saw Republicans there attempt to pass a very small, what some people have called skinny or emaciated bill. They attempted to pass a bill through Congress that included the enhanced unemployment insurance, which for some people was actually a stretch, considering that you have quite a few Republicans who don't, want to help Americans in that regard at all. And it also included small business loans. Now, again, favorite phrase again, I've mentioned in previous episodes how the small business loans that we have seen before, in the form of the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, quite frankly, when you look at the various forms of stimulus that this country has seen since March, because again, remember, economic stimulus is not just unemployment payments. It's not just those $1,200 checks. It's not just the PPP. It's not just the Main Street lending program. It's not just a moratorium. It's not just individually those things. The package is the collective of various things. But when you looked at the entire package, when you look at the entire stimulus package that we've seen since March, one of the least effective forms of stimulus has been the PPP. Why do I say that? Look at what the program was meant to do and what it actually did. Sure, it did provide for some businesses to, meet their payroll expenses, so on and so forth, for a set amount of time. But once that time kind of went away, there really was not, we didn't see any more impact, right? So for that reason, and I'm not going to like drag out this episode by kind of explaining what I mean by that, but it just, again, we just really didn't see we didn't get the bang for our buck that we were sold on regarding the PPP, which again, I find it interesting that we continue to hear the push for the PPP with both parties, with Democrats and Republicans, but a lot of push is coming from the Republicans. But anywho, so when we look at the most recent form of stimulus that the Republicans were willing to push in the form of this smaller package, it did not include direct payments to individual Americans. And when I say that, I'm not referencing the unemployment aspect of it, because by and large, that's only targeted. It's only targeted to those who are in a specific situation, people who are receiving unemployment benefits. But that $1,200 that we had seen before, that was more general. The only thing that really kind of kept people from getting that is if they made too much money, right? And people making too much money probably received other forms of stimulus depending on, what they did for a living. If they had a business, maybe they got the PPP, so on and so forth. But again, another subject for another day with that program, right? But so that's when we look at what Republicans are saying, specifically regarding stimulus, they are not saying the same things as Democrats, and they're really not saying much at all in way of specifically checks for individual Americans. And I really want you to kind of pay attention, because just even if you happen to, for instance, see the hearing that happened yesterday, there were various points. One of the things you really have to be aware of when you are listening to politicians is you have to be aware of the way in which they use language, right? Like, for instance, they'll say something along the lines of, yeah, we support stimulus. And in your mind, because you have an idea of what stimulus is and what it should look like, you assume that they mean that they agree with stimulus in the form of sending you and your family a $1,200 check. But in their mind, for them, stimulus is just giving money in the form of the PPP or the Main Street Lending Program, or specifically to only, specific industries such as the airline industry or the hotel industry. So I really want you to look at the way in which they use language, because they can use language in a way where they are very, very, very aware of the fact that other people, even though they say one thing, people who are listening may hear something completely different, something that actually works to their benefit. It works to their benefit when you think that they mean that they're going to send you a check, but what they actually mean is they're going to send the airline industry a check, or they're going to send a hotel a check. They have no intention of sending you a check at all. But so one more thing that I want to note here, because I don't want to make this very, very long. I referenced how Representative Al Green from Texas talked about how, Americans are losing their homes. One thing that was of particular importance that he mentioned as well was that there is this agency called the Government Accountability Office, and they found that the Treasury Department actually lacked data on a number of people who actually qualified for the first stimulus that we received, that set of checks that we received back in March, that was approved back in March, right? But specifically, they lacked data regarding the people who were supposed to receive them, but actually didn't yet receive them. That kind of struck me, because think about it. How often is it that the government decides to not track a specific, bit of information or a specific metric? Like, the government really keeps data for the government is very, very big. That also brings to mind another example of something we saw during the hearing. When the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, was kind of getting when we saw this kind of push where we were during the hearing, or the question was posed. I'm trying to think of the specific question. It was something along the lines of what exactly, when you guys came and you thought about the amount of stimulus that is needed to be adequate, what was that number? And this is kind of in reference. I apologize if I'm not kind of quoting it correctly or exactly, but we get a lot of pushback when we hear about how Nancy Pelosi is demanding that they be willing to stimulate the economy with $2.2 trillion, right? And you get a lot of pushback, and you hear, well, we don't need to spend that much money. Da, 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 da. But one of the things we saw during the hearing yesterday was this claim that, well, there is no specific number that we've determined to be adequate. People just kind of come up with their own numbers. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You mean to tell me that people who are working on behalf of our government are not tracking data? They don't have kind of basic numbers. They don't have data about people who've received checks. They have data about the dead people they sent checks to. They have data about fraudulent. You know what? Let me stop. Let me stop. But just, I want you to think, like, how often is it that, not only does our government lack data, but they kind of are able to claim this, they're able to claim ignorance, right? Well, we don't know how much money it's going to cost to stimulate the economy. We don't know. We don't have information about the people who were supposed to receive checks that didn't. Are you kidding me? If you don't, I'm sorry, you don't need to be in the position where you're sending out those checks. If you don't know how much money is going to take to stimulate the economy at an adequate level, you don't need to be in a position where you're even in that conversation. Like, are you kidding me? But here's the deal. I want you to realize something, and I'm going to end this here. I want you to be aware that they're doing this because they don't they recognize that the information that you would become aware of, if they presented you, just say, with that number that is adequate in terms of stimulating the economy, or the number of Americans that qualified for a stimulus check but still hadn't received it. They don't want to tell you those numbers, not because they can't figure them out. These people are very, very smart. They don't want to tell you those numbers because you would have something to gain. You would have something to gain, or the other political party would have something to gain, if they made it clear that X amount of people still hadn't received their checks, or if they made it clear that, you know what, yeah, Republicans are pushing for $1 trillion. No, not even that. $500 billion in stimulus spending, but we actually need somewhere around 1.82. Just kind of throwing some numbers out there. They don't want to tell you that, because what it would do is it would look bad for, even though these people claim to be not politically motivated and not really into the politics. Truth be told, they are representing a political party. They're representing a political administration, right? They are representing the Trump administration, and anything that speaks against the narrative that administration is trying to push is something that I can guarantee you they have been advised they need to fall in line with. You need to fall in line with the narrative that we are pushing. Otherwise, you have got to go. How many people have we seen get the boot from this administration because they weren't willing to toe the line? So don't you think for a second that that is not what we are seeing here, when we are being told that, well, gee, we don't have those numbers. We can't figure out those numbers. Oh, yes, you can. You just don't want to, because you want to keep your job. I can't fault you for that, but at least be honest about it, right? But then again, we can't expect that they're going to say, well, I can't give you those numbers because, if I do, I'm going to lose my job. I mean, we know for a fact they're not going to do that, but at least I want you to be aware of the fact that that is what we are seeing here. These people are not dumb. They can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They know that the numbers would not serve their political narrative very well, which is why we are not getting those numbers. So that, my friends, is what we are hearing, the very little that we are hearing from Republicans in terms of talks on economic stimulus.